In this lesson, we are considering two of the points of our syllabus in Unit 1, but they are very closely related. We're going to consider how to analyze a given problem to identify the boundary or scope of the problem, and we're also going to analyze a given problem to identify the constraints and limitations of the environment with relation to that problem. So what does this mean? Well, this is one of the first steps that we do when we get a problem. We try and work out, what does that problem actually mean that we need to do? What things must we do to satisfy the people who've set the problem to us? And the limitations would be the last thing. And they're the things that are, what are we physically able or capable of achieving in this particular context? So these are very practical questions that we need to ask and have answers for before we can really begin to address and work our way through solving a problem. So today we're beginning some problem analysis. And when we analyze a problem, we need to be able to identify, amongst other things, the project scope, so what the project is focused on and what the project is also not focused on. The constraints, so these are the things that we are told that we must do. So generally these will come out of the assignment that you are given. And the limitations, which are the things that are actually possible to be done in the first place. There are some other things that we will analyze in coming lessons that will help us to break down and work out how to deliver a problem. So we will come back to these in later lessons and add to our scope, our constraints, and our limitations. But based on a problem that we're given before we investigate our users and other situational requirements, we can just develop a beginning understanding of what we're actually going to do. So let's begin with project scope. So the project scope is simply a way to describe the work that you are agreeing to deliver. Okay? It's important to get your scope right. It defines what you're going to do to turn the project into a reality. The scope statement defines what's in and what's out of the project. So the scope statement says what is being delivered or what is in scope. What is the tangible thing that you are presenting at the end and what things are going to be in it? What is not being delivered? So what things you consider to be outside the scope of your project? Things that you could say are related to your project, but they're not going to be addressed because they're too big or not directly relevant to what needs to be done. We also need to work out some assumptions. Are there any assumptions that clarify the deliverables? Is there anything that we are assuming about our users or our situation that we don't actually know for certain, but we're just going to assume to make our life easier? And anything of the above that we need to clarify. So any changes, anything that we need to make more specific, and the like. So we're going to be able to work out today what's been delivered, what's not been delivered, and our assumptions, and we're not really going to go for clarifications yet. Clarifications will probably come later on when we get more information about the problem that we are trying to solve. So the scope statement typically discusses specific deliverables, but you could also be more specific and describe individual components of the solution as part of the scope. So for example, if you are saying that my project is just going to deliver some wireframes, which are pictures showing the design of a website, then you could actually go and be more specific, saying that the shopping cart part of that website is going to have PayPal as the main point of payment. And for the prototype, we're only going to show PayPal. So you define it specifically what is in and what's outside. You're nailing down the question so it doesn't become too big and get out of hand. Sometimes you can write the project scope all at once, but most times you're going to build it up as you consider new aspects of the problem. And we'll actually do that in this lesson. We will start with a preliminary scope, and then we'll come back at the end and we will build it up and add more things to it. So in order to develop a scope statement, we actually need to have a problem that we're going to address. So in these tutorials, this is the problem that we are going to consider. Benjamin Heads. It's a fictional community of around 8,000 people, It's a small town surrounded by unsullied forests and a golden beach. The town has a mean age for residents of 42 years old, with about 2.5 residents per household. It's mostly low density housing with a few apartments or townhouses, so it's mainly suburban. Employment for the residents comes mainly through retail, tourism, finance, and essential services. It's got 2 local high schools, 1 public, 1 private, and the equivalent number of primary schools. The town is centered around a main strip of shops. The problem. The town is serviced by limited public transport options. A local bus line services the needs of the school community and runs a loop service around the town 3 times a day, at 8 a.m., 1 p.m., and 5 p.m. There are no services on Sundays. There are also 3 independent taxi operators who run a fleet of 5 taxis between them. That means there are 5 taxis rolling around, and you have 3 different phone numbers to get hold of those 5 different taxis. The limited and uncoordinated public transport makes it difficult for some of the members of the community to maintain the mobility they require to enjoy a high quality of life and have their essential needs met. So that is the problem that we're facing with. We have to somehow solve the public transport woes of this community. So what we're going to talk about now is writing the scope statement. So this is the first time we're going to write a scope statement when we address a problem, and generally this is not that difficult to do. The first thing we're going to consider is a statement that draws the big picture. Essentially, we're going to summarize the statement. We're going to create an abstract summary. So 1 or 2 sentences, maybe 20 to 30 words tops, where we just crystallize the big picture of the problem. So what is the big picture of the problem here? You should take a moment to have a think about it. How would you summarize the problem that we are facing? So this is how I would summarize it. You may have come up with something slightly different. I'm saying the project aims to. So that's the first thing we're going to write down. It's a sentence starter. This project aims to achieve something. And what it aims to achieve is to improve the convenience of public transport in Benjamin Heads. That's the goal of my project. It plans to do this by what? By coordinating the bus and taxi services in the local area. So this is my basic starting point. I have to improve public transport in Benjamin Heads, and I can do that by somehow coordinating the bus and the taxi services in some fashion or get them a little bit more integrated. Okay, so that's all I had to do to start with. I've got my opening, my beginning grasp on this problem. So for now, that's pretty much all we can actually write. We don't really have any idea how we're going to implement any of this or any of the other requirements of the solution, but at least we've got to start. And we're going to come back and revisit this later on. Where we're going to go now is we're going to think about some of the constraints that are placed on us when we develop this problem. So a constraint is a restriction on the degree of freedom you have in providing a solution. Constraints, they're effectively global requirements. So they're things that maybe exist for limited development resources or a decision that restricts the way that you develop the system. Constraints can be related to things like economic or money. You might have no money to develop this solution. It could be political. It could be technical. You have to fit or manage or adhere to certain technical requirements. Technical requirements relate to potentially the equipment that you have available or the equipment that your users have available. And also they could be environmental. You might not be able to produce any waste in the community, or you might only have limited power supply or something related to that. Constraints can be connected to things like the resources you have in your project, the schedule or how much time you have to deliver the project. If you only have a limited amount of time, you can only deliver a smaller project. The target environment, so are you developing an Internet of Things application? Are you developing a mobile application, a website? or things connected to the system itself. What programming languages are available? So an example of a constraint could be the system will use the following programming languages. The system will use this required data. The system needs to run 24 hours a day. You only have this long to develop a project. You must use the colour scheme of the Brisbane City Council. They're all examples of constraints that could be given to you when you start a project. Often you're going to find the constraints written in the task sheet of an assignment. So that means you need to read the task sheet of an assignment or a brief and extract the constraints from it. It's a reading comprehension exercise. And you need to do that to acknowledge they exist and help them to frame the problem. So if we had this Benjamin Heads township presented as a task sheet, it might look something like this. So the context area is the information that was presented earlier in the side-by-side graphic. Underneath it says there is the task. And the task could say, prepare a technical proposal for a mobile-first web application to service the public transportation needs of the community of Benjamin Heads. You are to analyze existing digital public transportation systems and develop a non-coded interactive prototype for a new platform. You will then present a multimodal presentation of this technical proposal using communication appropriate to a technical audience using the EDGE model. So what you see on the screen in front of you is essentially all that you would get for a technical proposal assignment. You don't get any other information. Based on these couple of paragraphs alone, you have to develop a technical proposal to solve this problem. So looking at this, let's go through and extract some of the constraints, some of the things that we must do. So the first one, it must be a mobile-first web application. Okay, so what does that mean? It means it must be a website. We're told we must develop a website. So immediately that's going to put some type of limitations on us with terms of programming languages and development platforms. A website must be primarily designed for mobile phone use. So we need to focus on the mobile experience of the website as opposed to, say, the desktop experience. So the desktop could be considered the secondary platform, but we're focusing on mobile. So that is a constraint. A constraint is the solution must address public transport in Benjamin Heads. We must use this existing public transport infrastructure as the basis for our application. Are there any other constraints? Well, we need to think about existing public transportation solutions and systems and how they could be currently implemented. We want to do that so we can work out what works and what doesn't work. We don't want to build a system using all the wrong ideas. We want to try and use tried and tested ideas to get an optimal solution. We're told we must develop an interactive prototype, but it doesn't need to be coded. So we could build something in PowerPoint, something using Adobe XD, something using Figma or Sketch or Balsamic or any type of platform that allows us to develop an interactive prototype. We don't have to write any code, we just need to give the idea of what it might feel like to use that application. We must present a technical proposal using a multimodal. Okay, so that means that generally we're going to create a PowerPoint presentation and use it as a video. That seems to be the general way that people do multimodals in digital solutions. It means that I can't present paperwork and I can't just present a PowerPoint. I must present a video where it has demonstration and documentation, as if I was creating a presentation that I was going to send to a client. And they're looking at my presentation or my pitch and they're saying, that's a good presentation, here's $50,000, go and build the system. Because that's what a technical proposal actually really is. It's a selling document. You are selling the dream of this application to someone, so they give you money to go and develop it. Are there any other constraints? Yes. There are. We must use Edge to present the proposal. In our assignments, we must use Edge. It has to show the explore, develop, generate, and evaluate. So that brings us to the end of constraints. So there are quite a number of constraints that exist for our solution. The next thing we need to consider are limitations. So a limitation is what is actually possible given the resources that are available. These can include things like what target platform will allow you to actually do. So if we're developing for a mobile application, then you're going to have different features that might not be available on a desktop. So you might have, say, an accelerometer in your phone can vibrate, so give you haptic feedback. Your phone can make phone calls and things like that are not available on a desktop. Also, limitations could be the tools or the programs or the development environment that you have access to. What things can your development environment do? Do you know how to use it? What features and functionality will you employ? Is it up for the job? Or do you need to change it? So what are some of the limitations that we could have given this Benjamin Head scenario? Well, one limitation is since we're developing on mobile first, we have a limitation where we can access GPS. So it's something we can do. Like if we were doing desktop, we couldn't access GPS. We have text messaging capabilities. We can make phone calls. We can get haptic feedback. Limitation is we only have a small screen size. We don't have any keyboards. We don't have any mouse. We're probably restricted people using their thumb to swipe or select things with one finger. So there might be some physical limitations. What about data? Well, it's a small town and we don't actually know how good the mobile phone network is and how much data people have access to in this community. We don't have any of that technical information. This is a problem. It could be a limitation on our system. People only have limited mobile phone access or only have limited data on their system. And if they don't have limited data, then we are limited to providing only low bandwidth images or no video or things like that. So this could potentially be a limitation. Which brings us to our next point. We just had a problem. Well, in our limitation, we revealed that we had some missing facts or information that we need in order to be able to solve this problem effectively. So if this was a real world project, we could just go and find the town and obtain answers to our questions. We could know for certain if the township did have good mobile phone reception or whether it was just in a black spot. But it's not real and we can't go there. So what we can do instead is make some assumptions. So essentially we're going to make some stuff up. And we're going to be nice to ourselves and we're going to make up things that help us solve the project more easily. We're going to take away our problem by assuming some things about our situation. And we're going to call these things assumptions. For this project, we're going to assume that the town has excellent mobile phone connectivity and that data is readily available. So that's something that is an assumption that could get us over a potential limitation. And by making this assumption, and we would have to document it, we're actually making the project a little bit easier for us to consider and solve. And now we've done constraints and limitations, we can come back to writing the project scope. So this is what we had when we first visited the project scope earlier on. We had the project aims to improve the convenience of public transport in Benjamin Heads by coordinating the bus and taxi services in the local area. So at this point, when we first come across this, we didn't actually know how we're going to accomplish it. We didn't know what people wanted. We didn't know what form the solution would have. We didn't know what would function. We didn't know anything about the limitations or constraints, but now we do. So we can start to answer some of these questions about the scope. We can start to say exactly what needs to be delivered and potentially what doesn't need to be delivered. We can put in some assumptions that we have to deal with, and then we can clarify things if required. So first of all, what has been delivered in our scope? Well, we're going to deliver a technical proposal for a mobile-focused web application. That's what's been delivered. We're going to include a demonstration of a non-coded prototype. That's something else that we are going to make and produce and deliver. They're our deliverables so far. Okay? What is not being delivered? Because it's also important to say what we're not going to do. So we're going to say the project is only going to focus on the mobile phone implementation of the application and not consider the desktop, iPads, or any other tablet devices. So by saying that we're not considering the desktop, the mobile, the iPad, or any tablets, we have simplified our problem. We have said the only device that is in the scope of our problem is a mobile phone. And this has implications for us as we develop. So when we come to draw and make our interface, now we only have to consider the screen size of a mobile phone. We don't have to consider all the other screen sizes for all the other devices that could exist. We're only focusing on one form factor for our prototype and our application. Also, the project's not going to demonstrate any programming. So we don't have to write any code for this project. So we're not going to deliver any of that. And we're also making some assumptions. The project's going to assume that users are going to access the application on mobile, so not developed through desktop will not be a problem. And we're going to assume that users have good internet, they all have smartphones, and they're going to be able to access data without any problems. So now we have a better idea what we're doing. We're developing a project that's going to improve public transport in Benjamin Heads. It's going to be a mobile website. We're not going to worry about desktop. We are not going to worry about code. And all we're going to do is make up an interactive prototype that people can look at and consider and hopefully pay us lots of money to develop. So we'd spent a bit of time doing that. But now we have a good idea what we're actually in for. And we've simplified our problem a little bit, and we've clarified what we intend to do. So in summary, our scope details what's been delivered and what's not been delivered. It gives us any assumptions and any clarifications that we require. We will come back to this and we will add more to it as we go through and understand our users and what they need. Our constraints are the limitations that are placed on us when we create the project. You'll generally get these from the assessment item itself. Or if this was a corporate environment, your boss would say, these are the things that you must do to adhere to our branding or our company's position. So they're things that are non-negotiable. And our limitations were things that were actually possible to be done given the resources that we have available. So we did a fair bit of work there. We deconstructed a problem to get a starting scope and work out our constraints and limitations. So now it's time for you to scope this. So now you're going to see another project from a potential task sheet. From the information that you're presented with, you need to develop a project scope, work out the constraints, and develop a list of limitations and, if appropriate, some assumptions.